Hey guys, hope you are doing well. In today's vid as usual we will be continuing Dragon of Domination, so let's get into it. Chapter 7. Issei had to admit, he respected the courage the nun had displayed at the sudden appearance of Rias, her power of destruction crackling around her black and red, her expression of rage enough to even make Issei a little apprehensive. Without the knowledge that he was several times stronger than her even before his transformation, he would have been scared for his life. But the nun continued to heal him. And it wasn't that she wasn't aware of the danger she was in. Issei could feel her hands stiffening in fear, conducting her awareness about the impending possibility of death. But it was a credit to her courage that she didn't raise her head, not even to explain her situation, putting Issei's health above her own life, something that was a definite probability with Rias blinded with wrath. He decided that it would be a pity to let Rias kill her in a fit. Hi, Bucho, Issei said with an exaggerated cheer, complete with a casual wave, one that reminded her that he was alive and for a certain interpretation of the word well. Have you met my newest friend? He felt the nun tremble once more when he uttered his last word, but this time, he received a weird sense of joy from her. Her reaction to the word friend was weird, but calming Rias was more important, so he shelved the train of thought. The last thing he needed was Rias to think that clearly holy glow around the nun's hands was hurting him, and decide to remove the threat by going to the source. He carefully maintained the smile on his face, despite the strain he was feeling in preventing his regeneration factor to cure him instantly. What happened? Rias said, her voice cracking like a whip. Intimidating, but much better than the alternative of disintegrating the whole room with her power. Though it would have been even better if it wasn't for the black ball of energy, still hovering above her hand. Funny story, Issei said with a bloody smirk, one that put a slight smile on Ria's face despite the tightness of the situation. I had a disagreement over the proper place of devils with that distinguished gentleman over there, which was rather heated. The calmness he was displaying wasn't on the line with the mask he had previously displayed, but luckily, Rias wasn't in a mood to catch such a small detail. And ultimately, he needed to shed his useless mask at some point, and next to a skewered exorcist after a surprise death match was one of the best times to start doing so, where he could leverage double excuse of trauma and adrenaline. And my new friend, he continued, then looked at the nun expectantly. Asia, the girl murmured, blushing slightly as she raised her head, feeling confident that Issei wouldn't die from a second's break now that his wound stopped bleeding. My new friend, Asia-chan, decided to help me by warning me against the ambush, saving me from a certain death, he explained. It was a shameless exaggeration. Of course, under no condition a 2-bit exorcist could be a threat against him without a legendary holy sword, and even then, the ambush needed to be perfect. Still, exaggerating the importance of the nun would make it easier to take her along. And Issei wanted her around. Not only she tried to save his life, which deserved a reward, but also she was the perfect mixture of bravery and innocence, toppled by a certain blonde cuteness that could be converted to sexiness with a bit of careful training, like a cute toy one could ravage in sexual ecstasy. Also, training a virgin nun to a sex toy would be fun in its own, the perfect way to celebrate his devilness. I see, Rias said. She thought for a moment, deep in thought as she realized he had no idea of leaving her behind, obviously trying to come up with an excuse. Issei barely kept himself from rolling his eyes dismissively, waiting for Rias to recognize the opportunity. It took a few seconds for Ria's eyes to widen in shock, her gaze fixed on her hands above his wound. A nun, successfully healing a devil. Her mouth opened in excitement as the opportunity finally clicked in. We need to leave before reinforcements arrive. She turned to Asia. I'm sorry Asia-san, but we can't bring you with us. My teleportation spell only works for devils. Issei rolled his eyes, for her obvious poor attempt to force Asia to a quick decision. Sooner or later, Asia would learn the full capabilities of Rias, which obviously included teleporting normal people, and at that point, would start to resent her for her lies. Asia's eyes widened in shock. I understand, she murmured as she tried to stand up, but her trembling legs prevented her from doing so. She might be innocent, but she had no illusion of what awaited her if stayed behind. Still, no whisper of mercy left her mouth, silently accepting her death. That acceptance shocked Rias as well, who had been clearly expecting Asia to demand her help, which would allow Rias to breach the possibility of resurrecting her as a devil. Normally, it wouldn't be a problem. She would just fake sudden mercy, and offer the position as a devil herself. Unlucky for her, Issei was ready to steal his wind, along with the ultimate loyalty of Asia. Don't worry, Asia-chan, I won't leave you alone, I'll protect you. He didn't know which was more amusing, Asia's worshipful expression, or Ria's exasperated one. But Issei-kun, Ria started, frustrated by his sudden show of independence, but Issei glared at her, acting like he actually thought that he was going to let Asia to die. Rias flinched as she came to the conclusion that her poorly thought-out plan risked Issei's loyalty as well. She sighed resignedly, accepting the failure of the original track. The only way I could bring her with us is if she agreed to be resurrected as a devil. Me, a devil, Asia said in shock, but Issei was happy to note that there was no disgust or revulsion in her tone, just shock, similar to the shock of a friendless boy, suddenly being picked first to a game. Come on, Asia-chan, accept, Issei said even as he squeezed her hand gently. That way, we can hang together. We can go eat out, and we can even go to an amusement park. Then, he continued with a more serious voice. And even if you don't accept, I'll stay here, defending you to my last breath. That put an alarmed expression on Ria's face, who wasn't willing to exchange the wielder of the boosted gear for a healer, no matter how good or versatile that healer was, but she was smart enough to realize that interjecting wouldn't be helpful at that point. For a moment, Asia stood still, with an expression of intense concentration on her face, realizing the enormity of the decision she was facing. Issei knew that, even with the short time they spent together, his declaration to defend her even if she didn't become a devil actually made her likelier to accept Ria's offer. She was a kind girl, one that would sacrifice herself to an unholy life rather than let him sacrifice himself. Issei-kun, she asked with a trembling voice. Are you really going to be my friend? We're already friends, Asia, Issei said, squeezing her hand, which put the cutest blush on her face. Rias-san, Asia said with a nod. You can resurrect me a devil. Rias let out a relaxed breath, her stress evaporating, realizing that she had just gained another valuable peerage member rather than losing the most important one she had. She summoned her set and pulled out a bishop piece. Lay on the floor, she commanded. Asia turned to Issei, who nodded in approval. The actual resurrection was quite anticlimactic. Rias put the piece on Asia's chest, which was then absorbed into her body, which left her unchanged other than a sudden exhaustion, still conscious. It feels weird, but warm, Asia murmured sleepily. When the glow subsided, Issei lifted her in a bridal bold, which made her blush cutely. Rias looked at him, but he just smirked. A perverted reputation was definitely useful sometimes. Perfect. Rise, my bishop, Rias said, looking exhausted herself. She hadn't fought, but the emotional roller coaster she had gone through in the last few minutes had taken its toll. With a wave of her hand, she created another circle of teleportation, and Issei stepped through after her, still carrying Asia. You better get some rest, Asia-chan, Rias said kindly, which, Issei noted, was profoundly genuine. After all, while Rias could be selfish, but it was more of a combination of her entitled upbringing and the looming shadow of her upcoming marriage. Let's arrange a guest room for you for now. We can arrange something more permanent tomorrow. I don't think I can stay alone, she murmured in a sudden burst of courage, despite a blush thick enough to drown in. Can I stay with? She tried to say, but words failed her halfway. She took a deep breath, and repeated. Can I stay with you, Issei-kun, she said, this time managing to complete her sentence. Issei looked at Rias for her to agree first, trying to sell the impression that he still followed her orders, that his earlier display of disobedience was an anomaly. He expected her to look concerned, but she just nodded happily, indicating that she had missed the danger of having a peerage member more loyal to another member than her king. Another big mistake in her part, one that Issei had no problems in exploiting. Of course you can, Asia-chan, he said. Rias moved away, trusting Issei to handle the rest. She probably also hoped that with her obvious hero worship and his perversion, Asia would be willing to take Ria's role to train him in the special way he needed. Issei said nothing as he walked to his room, still carrying Asia with a bridal hold. When they arrived at his bed, she was already asleep, with her arms around his neck too right to unravel. He didn't bother to unwrap them as well, treating her like a particularly enthusiastic teddy bear. Tonight, She deserved her rest. Tomorrow, Issei was going to teach her how to have fun. The next day, Issei had woken up with a murmur from Asia, followed by a tightening of her arms around his torso. It's not a dream, she stammered in a desperate whisper, like a lost traveler in the desert, afraid of the pond in front of her might disappear at any moment. It's real. Good morning, Asia-chan. Did you sleep well? He said with a smirk on her face. Yes, she murmured for a moment before the realization about their extreme closeness finally clicked. Issei-san. She exclaimed as she jumped back in panic, sliding out the covers, her shyness taking control. You are rather cheerful, he said with a smirk before letting a serious expression to take its place. So, how do you feel? Confused, and a little exhausted, she murmured, still shy. Both are completely understandable. Exhaustion is linked to your new life as a devil. Sunlight saps a part of your power, but the effect will affect you less as you get stronger. And confusion is inevitable. After all, your life changed last night. He walked up to her until he was close enough to grab her hand, squeezing gently to share friendship. But don't worry, I'll be there with you, he added, fully aware that in her fragile state, just a touch of kindness was all that was needed to create a loyal follower, nothing else necessary. And if he were, to be honest, he pitied her a bit as well, and wanted to give her a better life than she had experienced up until now. Luckily, it wasn't a difficult challenge. He prompted her to tell a bit about her circumstances, which unlocked her emotional gates. For the next hour, she went through her life in the church, her sacred gear, her status as the Holy Maiden, her abandonment after the discovery that her powers also worked on devils, therefore, indicating unholy roots, fallen angels taking her in, and the fateful night that the exorcist revealed the depth of their mercilessness. Issei hugged her tight as she cried against his chest, ignoring the temptation to push her into the deep end of the sexuality. After all, slowly corrupting an innocent nun would be much more amusing. Maybe he should encourage her to become a dominatrix. Even imagining her standing above a bound Rias, with a whip in hand, clad in red leather, but still stammering while she tried to give commands. Don't worry, these days are behind you now. You're going to have much more fun as time goes. Despite her suddenly intensifying crying, he could feel her smile widening as well. Maybe you should take a shower, you're still bloody from the last night, after all. Asia nodded, and Issei pointed at the shower, slightly disappointed that stepping inside with her was not an option. He wanted to taste her cutely sexy body, curvy despite her shortness, but not to the point that he was willing to destroy all the progress he had managed to gather. With a disappointed sigh, he left the room. It didn't take long for him to run across Rias. Issei-kun. Good morning, Rias said with a forced cheerfulness, trying to act like it was an accident that she was at the corridor Issei was in, which would have been more believable if he hadn't been able to feel her familiar floating behind him, reporting her about his position and actions. It was with them during the night as well, probably to make sure Issei hadn't pushed Asia in her vulnerable state too much. Another point in Ria's benefit. Good morning, Bucho. You look beautiful this morning, he said, for once letting a certain dragonic allure slide his voice, putting a sudden blush on Ria's face. Issei spent the seconds Rias had used to gather herself to examine the way she dressed. Since it was the weekend, she was out of her uniform, replaced by an unappealing combo of sweatpants and a crop top. Or more accurately, it would have been unappealing if they weren't designed to someone a couple sizes smaller both on top and bottom, looking tight enough to be painted on, making her lack of bra extremely obvious. Due to its nature, he wasn't able to ascertain whether it was true for her panties as well, but even if she had, its insubstantialness was definitely not in doubt. Thanks, Issei, Rias murmured a few moments later, acutely aware that Issei had spent the break undressing her with his eyes, a task made much easier by the fact that he had first-hand knowledge about the treasures that lay underneath but trying to act nonchalant. How are you after the last night? I'm sure it hadn't been easy, taking a life. Issei shrugged, not really willing to play the wimpy depressive kid after the combat. It's easier to handle than I would have guessed, maybe because that exorcist was obviously crazy. Still, the fact that I had to take a mortal wound just to keep up with a normal human is worrying. Maybe we should intensify our training. Do you think Akano-chan is available for another session? Akano is currently busy, Rias said with surprisingly thick rancor, her childish jealousy clear in her tone. It's us, then, Issei said with a dismissive shrug as he grabbed Ria's wrist. He had already dragged her into one of the unused rooms when Rias realized that she had ignored a perfectly acceptable opportunity to excuse herself to leave the task to her queen instead. But as he closed the door, Rias had a blush on her face that was only partly about the loss of opportunity. After all, during their last time, she had experienced a rather obvious orgasm, and such a pleasure was doubtlessly hard for a devil to ignore. With that in mind, she had reacted rather slowly when Issei took an unexpected action, and pushed her against the wall, her chest pressing the wall. A gasp escaped as she was pinned against the wall, but rather than pushing him back, her gaze stayed stuck at his fist, which was pressing against the wall. Or more accurately, her eyes were stuck on his sacred gear, fascinated by its thick crimson glow, several times stronger than their last encounter, a corresponding metaphysical weight of his power pressing against hers. Not wanting to miss the opportunity, he pressed his shaft, unfortunately still in its confines, against her shapely bottom, his erection lodged in her generous booty. He was curious how far he was going to be able to push her in her distracted state. Fanfiction just in community forum more The Dragon of Domination by Attached of Darkness anime, High School DxD, Haisuku Ru D times D rated. M. English, H. Issei. Rias G. Gabriel. Graphia L. Words. 50k plus. Faves. 3k plus. Follows. 4k plus. Published. February 21, 2019 updated. August 21, 2021 711 Chapter 8 Rias's fascination with the sudden power-up of his sacred gear was an opportunity that he had no intention of missing. Even after a couple of days, and despite its rather enjoyable benefits, wearing the mask of the idiot had started to take its toll on him, with his dragon instincts begging to be released. It was time to cut loose. And it wasn't like there was a huge risk doing that. He hadn't been expecting Rias to have an iron will, but the last 2 days showed him that playing her was almost trivial, her rather gullible nature further enhanced by the shadow of her upcoming marriage. With Issei finally giving her a chance of escape, she had little option to push back against it. With that in mind, he let his free hand land on her thigh with a sharp move, making her flinch, but when she kept her gaze on his sacred gear when he increased the radiance of power. Not one to miss such an opportunity, he let his hand climb upwards, a movement she barely reacted even when his fingers sank into the toned flesh of her lower cheeks, his shaft still resting comfortably in the middle. You seem distracted, Bucho, he whispered into her ear before leveraging the proximity to leave a string of gentle bites on her neck, each leaving her shuddering rather explosively, courtesy of additional boosting he applied on the pleasure created by each bite. The finer applications of the boost effect were much easier when applied on more direct effects like raw pleasure or pain, especially when the gauntlet was out its full state, giving him access to most of its powers. I'm not distracted, Issei-kun, she managed to whisper several seconds later, but before she could even answer, her hips were already grinding against his crotch, unexpected passion taking control of her actions. I'm just helping you to unlock your power, as any good king would. And what if I told you that you didn't need to degrade yourself like this, that I was okay with earning power in a slower, but a safer manner, he added, enjoying the way she suddenly stiffened. Just as I suspected, you're pushing my development dangerously for your own benefit. How devious of you, Rias-chan, he whispered, keeping her pinned against the door even as she tried to turn to face him. It's not like that, Issei-kun, she tried to explain, only to be interrupted by a spank on her bottom, a hard one that would have stung despite her enhanced resistance. She struggled to get away, but curiously, failing to push Issei away. With the current level of power Issei was applying, she would have no problems pushing him if she used a significant fraction of her strength, not to mention an impressive array of magic she could use to help. The fact that she limited herself despite the situation meant that she was trying to recover from her slip of the tongue in a more peaceful manner, without alienating him, which suited him just fine. He already had a payment in mind for her impudence. Don't lie to me, Rias-chan, I'm not an idiot. It's obvious that for some reason you're doing your best to speed up my development, and it's only expected that it comes with serious drawbacks. Otherwise, it would be a standard method. So, tell me, what's the big thing that made you risk my health without even having the courtesy to ask, he said. Funnily enough, it was actually correct. Like the dangerous technique she applied at their first night, his quickened development would have significant downsides in a few years in the future if he was actually as weak as he had been pretending to be. For the next several seconds, Rias was silent as she desperately tried to come up with an excuse that wouldn't burn the bridge between them. He used the opportunity to explore her body in a much rougher fashion, his hand slipping under her shirt first, then her bra to have direct access to her supple breasts, sinking into her flesh roughly. The pain jerked her awake off her thoughts, but she made no move to push him back, afraid to anger him. "My family signed a betrothal agreement that would see me married before I could even finish the high school," she explained, a panicked urgency coloring her tone. Issei smirked in satisfaction but continued squeezing her glorious breasts harshly, his hips engaged once more, rubbing his shaft against her bottom, unfortunately, both of them still clothed. "And you're hoping to use a rating game to force the dissolution of the agreement," Issei completed, an amused smirk on his face as Rias turned her head shocked. "How do you know?" she asked. "Come on, Rias-chan. Only an idiot would miss the fact that devils are using rating games to solve literally any conflict they face. You guys have a rather simplistic worldview that unfairly favors the strong, you know." Rias didn't answer, still too shocked by the way her scheme, if that simplistic ploy even deserved to be called, that collapsed around her without any warning. "Luckily for me, I'm going to be one of the strong ones." Then he let his expression turn into fake anger. "If your approach hadn't already damaged my potential too much, of course." "Issei-kun, I'm sure that," she tried to explain, but he cut her off once more, this time, using his gauntleted hand to spank her, the pain much sharper. "No, Rias-chan, you can't escape the situation by quoting the probabilities, not when you didn't even give me a chance to accept willingly." Once again, Rias stayed silent for a while, a break he had used to trail circles on her bottom with his metal-covered finger, careful not to damage her skin, while his other hand continued its job of testing the suppleness of her breast. "So, what now?" she asked in a trembling tone, her fear palpable. "Luckily for you, I'm a merciful guy, especially when such a sinful example of beauty is concerned," he said, her relaxation under his touch palpable. "But, there should be still a punishment, otherwise, the lesson wouldn't stick." "What punishment?" she tried to ask, only to be silenced by another metallic spank. "No questions," he said smugly. "It's a punishment, not a bargain. You either accept, or I walk away," Issei added, pushing the envelope with a threat to a point he hadn't been planning even a few minutes ago. Apparently, his fake personality and the necessity to play the subservient servant was annoying him even more than he had first assumed. "I choose punishment," Rias answered quickly, making him let out a relaxed breath. It would have been annoying if his plan had been destroyed by a momentary loss of control. "Good girl," he said as he pulled back and walked towards the nearest chair, but he kept his hand in her shirt, meaning she was dragged along for the ride, only removing it when he arrived on a chair, in a careless manner that sent buttons flying around the room. Then, he forced her to lay on his knees, making her take a classical pose of spanking, complete with her skirt pushed up to reveal her bottom, insufficiently covered by her panties. "The rules are simple. I'm going to spank you 10 times, he explained even as he caressed her bottom gently while she relaxed. "But there are 3 rules. First, you're going to count every single one of them. Second, you're going to thank me appropriately when I'm finished. Third, if you speak any other word, or miss a count, I'm going to restart." He then spanked her bottom with his right hand, but only after letting his sacred gear to dispel. He didn't want to turn her delicious bottom to a bloody mess, after all. "Is that clear?" "It's clear, Issei-kun," she gasped helplessly, but he was experienced enough to detect arousal in her tone. Not surprising, considering she was literally a spoiled princess that hadn't been seriously punished before, so receiving it in such a sexualized context worked wonders. The first spank landed on her bottom, a light one that could be easily classified as a warm-up. "1," she said obediently. The next 4 came rapidly, each stronger than the last, but she still counted every single one of them obediently despite her ass starting to glow with a watered-down color of her hair. Also, his fingers lingered on her bottom after every spank, once again without earning any errant comment. Issei decided to push the envelope, so, when the next spank landed, his touch lingered on her body even more while slipping to the dangerous regions. "Say 7," She stammered in shock as his fingers traced her nether lips, but contrary to his expectations, she didn't break the rules. So, during the next collusion, he hooked his fingers to her panties, ripping them off without a warning, finally managing to break through her tattered control. Issei-kun, she exclaimed as she tried to stand up, but he was ready for it. His free hand slid into her hair, pinning her in place roughly, this time, making sure that she required a significant portion of her power to free herself. She didn't even come close to applying it. Somebody forgot the rules, Issei said gleefully as another spank landed on her bottom, even harder, and her bottom was even bereft of the protection that was provided by her panties. The result echoed in the room. Rias turned to face him, her intention to argue clear on her face, but she wasn't ready to meet with the domineering face of a dragon, one that would never allow even the slightest disrespect. She probably didn't even realize the reason for her sudden loss of will as she took her earlier position, her naked ass free for Issei's attention. 5, she called a moment later, after obediently recounting 5 stiff blows that Issei landed on her bottom in rapid succession. 5 beats that turned her bottom into a bruised mess that somehow looked even more delicious. 5 beats that completely destroyed Ria's preconceptions about him. At least, that was what he assumed, as unfortunately, mind reading wasn't one of his abilities. He wished it was, as it would be fun to have real-time commentary while she was punished by her pawn, the same pawn she had taken in the expectations of having an obedient tool. When the 6th blow connected, Issei didn't pull his hand away immediately. Instead, he gently caressed her nether lips, enjoying their wet state. A tremor went through her body with shock, but she still obediently accepted as he traced a path over her most sensitive spot. At the 7th blow, he was lingering over the entrance, occasionally slipping just a bit in without earning the slightest complaint. Issei was officially impressed, not enough to actually have mercy on her, of course. So, the 9th exploded her skin like a clap of thunder, one that actually brought tears to her face despite her magical endurance. And this time, his fingers parked at her entrance, his thumb skillfully sliding towards her knob, circling around it gently. Once again, she obediently stayed silent, so Issei slipped his fingers inside her, in a sudden rapidness that caught her by surprise. And before she could say anything, he rapidly boosted her pleasure twice, and even if she wanted to say anything, her moans didn't allow. It didn't take long for her to climax under his relentless assault, shivering and trembling on his lap. He spanked her once more, this time softer in a rare feeling of mercy. 10, she murmured dreamily, but made no attempt to stand up. Curious, he spanked her once more. 11, she continued, making another hungry smile to blossom on his face. If she was too distracted to stop, he wasn't above abusing the golden opportunity it created. Issei decided to stop once they reached 30, with 2 more breaks where Rias recovered from her unexpected orgasms. He pulled her until she was sitting on his lap, a combined mess of crying and trembling, but still sexy despite that. He hugged her gently, and she wrapped her hands around his chest in response. I'm sorry, Issei-kun, she slurred, acting like she was drunk. And maybe she was, as devils were much more linked to their primal sensations, and it was likely the first time Rias had experienced such a confusing assault of pleasure and pain. I didn't want to let you die, but I can't afford your rejection. I can't spend my life as a slave to that idiot. Please forgive me, she continued, words spilling her mouth unintentionally. He doubted whether she would be able to remember all of them, but enough should stick, making his life even easier. I understand, Rias-chan, he said as he gently clasped her chin and forced her to raise her head, slowly kissing her cheeks until he got rid of all of her tears, which took a while as she continued to cry. She giggled at his sudden gentleness, and he chose that moment to seal her lips with a soft, lingering kiss. You're forgiven, he said after pulling back, but this time, it was Rias who interrupted him with a searing kiss of her own. What followed was one of the most difficult moments of his life, going through Ria's searing kiss while her naked lips rubbed against his crotch, his pants barely able to keep his own erection at bay as her juices seeped into the fabric. It was a pity that he couldn't use the opportunity to its full potential, not when taking her virginity would trigger several unfortunate clauses in her betrothal agreement, which would have complicated their situation even further. Of course, while he couldn't fully benefit from the situation, it didn't mean that he was going to let the situation go without some compensation. Ripping off her shirt was trivial for his strength, and her bra ended up suffering a similar treatment, leaving her skirt as the only piece of clothing on her body, which was pretty ineffective as a cover as it gathered around her waist. Only when she shuddered helplessly on his lap once more, he gently pushed her away. Issei-kun? She asked in a trembling tone, too far gone to form a coherent sentence. Look what you have done, Issei answered as he pulled out his shaft, hard and ready. It's your responsibility to fix, he added as he pushed Rias back, and a small tap behind her knees later, she collapsed on the floor, her kneecaps loudly hitting the floor, extracting a surprised gasp. The mixture of pain and shock worked wonders to dispel the confusing haze she was under. A cold realization hit her face as she tried to process the indignity she had went through, her mouth slackened with shock as the realization hit. Unfortunately for her, Issei had no intention to allow her to act on that realization. He grabbed the back of her head with one hand while used the other to free his shaft, and Rias found herself impaled with his shaft. Ria's shock only intensified at the moment, and Issei used the moment to pull her even deeper, until his shaft was deeply lodged in her throat. For a moment, he lamented that he wasn't recording the moment, as the outrage on Ria's face one of the most delicious views with his girth forcing her lips wide while she tried to breathe. Then, a desperate resignation took its place, thanks to the earlier loss of control and revealed secrets, sapping her will to push back. He knew that after this, Rias would avoid him for a few days at least, so he decided to enjoy the moment to the max. He used one hand to push her even deeper on his shaft, invading her throat completely. He stabbed sharp enough to make her gasp and wheeze despite her supernatural constitution. His other hand slid down until his fingers met with her naked tits, mauling them in an equivalent lack of restraint. Soon, her hands found his thighs, tapping desperately as she tried to breathe, but Issei ignored these attempts, just as he ignored her ineffectual attempts to push herself away using his thigh as leverage. Since she was too distracted to use her strength effectively, he hadn't even used his real strength to keep her in place. Already primed due to earlier punishment game, it didn't take more than a few minutes for Issei to reach the edge. He pulled out at the last second, covering Ria's ragged face and bruised breasts with his seed, who was trying to decide between shame and outrage, her expression cycling rapidly. Before she could decide on one, however, Issei cut in. Thanks, Bucho, he said with mock earnestness. I accept your apology. Will I see you at dinner? Reminding her about the guilt and fear that forced her to the situation in the first place proved to be the last touch. Too overwhelmed with the situation, she just grabbed the ripped remains of her shirt for coverage. Maybe, but I need to go, she murmured rapidly as she jumped to her feet, turning towards the door at the same time. Issei didn't miss the opportunity and landed a playful slap on her hips, and she dashed away like a startled mare. See you around, Bucho, Issei said with a smirk, his mind already on how to quicken his plan to dominate the rest of the peerage. Fanfiction just in community forum more The Dragon of Domination by a Task of Darkness anime, High School DxD, Haisuku Ru D times D rated. M. English, H. Issei. Rias G. Gabriel. Graphia L. Words. 50k plus. Faves. 3k plus. Follows. 4k plus. Published. February 21, 2019 updated. August 21, 2021 711 Chapter 9 Issei wasn't surprised when Rias avoided him for the rest of the day. After all, the sudden reversal she had experienced would be difficult to process for anyone, and even the best devils weren't famous for their adaptability. And as a spoiled princess who had been protected for all her life, Rias could be hardly qualified for that part. Since spending the rest of the day with Rias wasn't an option, Issei spent most of his day on a date with Asia where he had shown her around the town while also subtly probing her about her commitment to religion, though he had put a few hours for training as well. Not the real variety, unfortunately, as it wasn't feasible with all the observers, the fake one, but with a significantly increased aptitude for his sacred gear in a visible location, trying to prove Rias that her humiliating punishment was actually quite useful. Rias wasn't there to observe him, neither in person nor through a hidden familiar. A proof of her distraction, but Issei hadn't felt dismayed, because Akano was there, watching him with an excited expression on her face from the corner she thought herself to be hidden, no doubt imagining about a particularly humiliating session of domination. But she took action, and since Issei had to act like he was unaware of her presence, he went to his room, writing off the night as a boring bust. Then, he heard a knock on the door. "Come in," he called with an excited smile when he felt a familiar presence on the other side of the door. His visitor followed his request and slowly opened the door, revealing it was Asia on the other side, dressed in a long, extremely conservative sleeping gown that started tight from her neck, and went down to her ankles. No doubt a special request from her, as he doubted Rias had such a boring thing in storage. For all of her faults, she knew how to present her assets, and assets of her peerage. A pity, Issei decided even as Asia walked in, closing the door behind her. As while Asia was on the small side, she still had a body too beautiful to be hidden in such a manner. "How can I help you, Asia-chan?" Issei said with a smirk, not bothering to hide the edge, as Asia was too innocent to pick the message up before it was too late. "Do you mind if I stayed here for a while?" Asia murmured even as she wrung her hands, displaying her nervousness. "Did you have a nightmare?" Issei asked, and received a trembling nod in return, one that reminded him of a scared songbird. It was a pity that the little songbird was unaware that the cave she tried to hide housed a dragon. "And you want to stay here until you feel less scared, so you can go back to your room?" Asia nodded again. "Would you like to stay with me instead like we did last night?" he asked. "Can I?" she asked excitedly before her rationality could reassert itself, along with a frown. "But I can't, it would be a sin." "God." She tried to continue, only to stop by a wince as the holy name itself gave her pain. "Come on, Asia, there's no sin in helping a struggling friend," Issei said, fully aware that it was wrong. "You have just gone through several traumatic events one after another, and a little comfort from a friend is definitely deserved." She nodded, then ducked her head to hide the rapid blush that was spreading to her face, one that Issei let to possess her face, no doubt due to her mind suddenly running amok due to possibilities. He wasn't surprised, not after he had spent their date subtly flirting with her to put the idea in mind. He wanted his loyal healer, and he wanted to tame her as soon as possible. He let out a subtle chuckle as he lifted the cover, and Asia slid underneath it, though she stayed a good distance away from him, possibly due to the size of the bed. Something Issei didn't want to allow. "Don't be shy," Issei said as he put his arm around her waist, and pulled her closer with a chuckle. "That's too close," she said after a shocked gasp. As she tried to wiggle out of his hug, but it lasted suspiciously short. "Come on, Asia, don't worry too much, or you'll have wrinkles on your pretty face," he said, making Asia blush even more. "But it's sinful," she murmured in response, but her lack of conviction was obvious from the way she pressed her body against Issei's, her crush and emotional worship stronger than the tatters of the emotional conditioning of the life she spent in church. He suspected her conversion to a devil was playing a role as well, making her more receptive to conceptual sins, not that he complained. He decided to face her complaints directly. "Come on, Asia, you're a devil now, so worrying about sinning is pointless." "But," she tried to answer, only to Issei to cut her off. "No buts. The church has no right to push their twisted sense of morality to you, especially not after they kicked you just because you followed their tenets and showed mercy. Why should you be obligated to follow their orders while they ignore their basic responsibilities? Isn't it bad to sin?" Asia questioned in a trembling voice, her conviction wavering already. "Not all so-called sins are equal," Issei explained. "Yes, it's bad to hurt others, but what about simple things that hurt no one? They were ridiculous enough to forbid masturbation, despite the fact that it doesn't hurt anybody. Such a ridiculous thing," he continued, the anger in his tone not exactly faked. He had always found the ban on masturbation very offensive, to the point he would act against the church in an offensive manner once he was strong enough. "Masturbation!" Asia exclaimed panikedly, her sensibilities unable to handle the word itself. "Exactly. It's both enjoyable and harmless, so why should anyone stop themselves from doing it?" Issei explained heatedly before noticing the expression on her face. He suddenly felt suspicious that Asia was even purer than he had expected. "You have masturbated before, right?" he asked, only to receive a subtle shook of the head. Surprised, he kept his gaze on her until she whispered one trembling word. "No. That's a travesty," he said with a chuckle, though he made sure to finish it with a soft breath, targeting Asia's neck, which made her wiggle in confusion while her body triggered in anticipation. We should fix it right now. He said even as he put his hand on her leg, above her nightgown to not to scare her off, and slowly dragged upward. Issei-kun, what are you doing? She exclaimed in panic, her voice loud enough to make Issei glad that he had put silencing charm. With their familiars absent, Rias and Akino had no idea what was going on in his room, which allowed him to act much more decisively while seducing her. I'm helping you, as any good friend would, he said, shamelessly abusing Asia's sense of gratitude towards him. And as a devil, she had to learn it one way or another, and the current manner was one of the best to enable it. But, she tried to say, only to cut herself short when she met with Issei's best charming smile, subtly enhanced by his magical presence. Despite their violent reputation, dragons could be really charming when they wanted to. Trust me, and close your eyes, Issei whispered into her ear. Asia trembled with an emotion other than fear. After all, while she might have been inexperienced, her body was mature enough to trigger her instincts, no doubt helped by her devil nature. With her eyes closed, Issei gently caressed her body, focusing on her thighs and stomach, occasionally bringing his fingers to her neck, enjoying her soft skin. He avoided overtly sexual points at first, giving her time to get used to his touch. It wasn't a surprise that a gasp escaped her mouth soon after, followed by her eyes popping in shock. Don't worry, it's natural, Issei whispered softly while the dance of his fingers continued, and she closed her eyes once more, unable to resist his gaze. Soon, another gasp left her mouth, followed by a barely suppressed moan, but neither was shocking enough to make her open her eyes. He was patient in his treatment. After all, unlike Rias, Asia hadn't done anything to earn his annoyance, therefore deserving of his kindness. Though, the cute little moan when his hands drifted on her chest was a temptation hard to resist. But thanks to his playing with Rias earlier, he was not tempted to ruin his plan by hurrying. Instead, he drew a gentle, patient spiral until he reached her nipples, even though the effect wasn't as tempting with her thick bra on the way. Enough patience, he decided as he put his fingers on her thigh once more, just above her knee. But this time, his fingers were on her naked skin rather than touching over the thick texture of her dress. And just like that, Asia's eyes popped open once more, her mouth open to deliver her complaints. Issei was ready for it. While he was tempted to catch her lips in a searing kiss, that would ruin his slow play. Instead, he pressed his lips on her neck, her lack of familiarity with pleasure enough to trigger a shocked moan while he gently sucked her skin. And her distraction allowed his fingers to slowly climb up her thighs, her supple skin folding under his touch. Then, his fingers were lingering over her most sensitive spot, her panties as the only protection. Issei wished a camera to be there to record, as the expression of utter shock on her face while she faced the rush of unfamiliar pleasure was delicious. You understand my point about pleasure, right? Issei whispered into her ear even as he gently circled her knob repeatedly, taking it slowly not to destroy her under the rush of pleasure. It's too much, she gasped. I didn't know such pleasure was possible. It's just a beginning, Asia. It's nothing compared to what's about to come, he explained even as his fingers slipped underneath her panties, touching her naked skin. There, she managed to surprise him, as the unfamiliar sensation of his naked touch, along with her anticipation, was enough to trigger her orgasm, leaving her moaning and shuddering. Issei smirked in amusement while he whispered sweet nothings to her ear, stopping his intimate massage for the moment. He knew that Asia was not in a point to resist his touch that soon after her first orgasm, but that didn't mean he was going to stay idle. With a flex of his mana, he disintegrated her bra and panties, as they were too boring to play. Then, he took a deep breath and cast the same spell, this time targeting her nightie, but in a much more difficult manner, as he was aiming to thin her nightie rather than destroy completely, a display of precision that would have been impossible before his conversion. How was it? He whispered, once again his lips caressing her ear. It was unbelievable, Asia murmured, still trying to catch her breath. I could never imagine such pleasure was possible. Not bad for the first round, right? Issei said even as he unbuttoned her shirt, revealing her creamy skin to his attention, her areolas peeking from the corner. First round. Asia gasped, but the rest of her words disappeared in another moan when he grabbed her nipple and squeezed gently, making her face yet another unfamiliar sensation, while his other hand started caressing her lower lips once more, this time with a much more determined and quick manner. Asia's moans rose once again under his determined assault while his fingers probed her entrance occasionally, but not pushing forward. Issei didn't say anything, and Asia couldn't say anything. So, the rest of the moments passed in a unique silence if one discounted Issei's occasional erotic whisper, and Asia's unbounded moans. Issei only stopped after Asia climaxes neared double digits, her virgin and innocent body helpless under the grasp of the dragon. She was especially exhausted when he stopped giving her enough time to breathe between orgasms, which made her exhaustion even stronger. Ultimately, Issei decided to let her rest a couple of hours later. Do you still think the church was justified in forbidding masturbation, Asia-chan? Issei whispered as he spooned the not-so-innocent blonde, his heat wrapping around her like an extra blanket. Damn the church, she murmured, barely coherent as she tried to stay awake, only to fail badly against her exhaustion. She fell asleep, unable to hear Issei's chuckles. Issei followed her soon after. In the morning, Issei felt Akino's presence well before she arrived at his door, but hadn't felt important enough to react. If it had been before he disciplined Rias, he might have tried to hide Asia, but she was sufficiently distracted by the excessive punishment she received, and the fact that her pawn was actually aware of her plan. That left Akino as the only person to suppress before he could start acting freely in the peerage. And since he was supposed to be in the training area with Akino in a few minutes, there was no point hiding his other achievements. His position was too assured for it to be a risk. Of course, that didn't prevent Akino from letting out a shocked gasp when she opened the door, nor it prevented a newly awakened Asia to yelp in panic before hiding under the blanket like a cute little rabbit. Well, she murmured, trying to hide her shock. What a surprise. Issei used the moment given by Akino's shock to devour her vision. Since it was the weekend, she chose to dress in something other than her school uniform, choosing to dress in the garb of a shrine maiden. A modified one, of course, with a shorter skirt and a deep cleavage, displaying Akino's assets to a maximum effect while still paying lip service to her traditional behavior. Asia had trouble sleeping, so she decided to ask for my help, Issei explained, more to make Asia relax rather than convince Akino, as the smell in the room was rather distinctive, especially a devil's enhanced senses. But Akino's shock soon melted, leaving its place to amusement, a sign that Rias hadn't shared what happened with Akino, as Akino was smart enough to understand the implications of such rapid seduction domination chain. Is that so? Akino said with a smirk as she took a step forward, but Issei gestured her to stop. Akino-chan, why don't you go ahead in the training area and start the preparations? I'll be there shortly, he said. Akino opened her mouth, but before she could say anything, Issei hit her with the concentrated pressure of his dragonic soul. And just like that, another gasp escaped her mouth, her eyes wide, her arms raised, ready to summon a shield. A frustrated expression replaced her panic when she met with Issei's smirk, soon turning into anger. The reason was simple. Akino prided herself in her calm and her ability to control the situation, both destroyed under his dragonic aura. Maybe I will. Issei-kun, Akino answered in a dark tone that would have sent shivers to the spine of a lesser man. I will go ahead and prepare for the training field. Don't be rude and keep an innocent maiden wait too long, okay? She said, and Issei just snorted. A devil who fashioned herself as a dominatrix with a lightning proficiency was difficult to refer to as innocent. Is she gone? Asia murmured when the door slammed, her head still underneath the blanket. Yes, she's gone, Issei said, but Asia still stayed underneath the blanket, so he pulled it off, revealing Asia's visage, still looking rough after last night's activities. Issei-kun, she exclaimed as her shyness exerted itself once more, especially when she noticed the absence of her bra and panties, and the fact that her nightie had turned transparent. No need to feel shy, he said even as he hugged her body once more, and despite her shyness, Asia melted against his touch. I need to go for my training session, he said, only for a complicated expression to appear on Asia's face, confusion and desire battling for dominance against her shyness. But first, let me show you another little trick, he added, and before Asia could answer, he ripped off her nightie with one pull. While Asia was busy processing her shock, Issei had already buried his head between her legs, his tongue out, brushing her nether lips. Her shocked cry was soon replaced by the cries of pleasure, her body too hungry for pleasure after the last night's treatment. Do you want me to continue? Issei asked after a couple of moments, and she just nodded. I want an answer, Issei repeated. For a moment, she was stunned, overwhelmed by the requirement of mentioning her desires explicitly. She gazed at him, hoping to find a reprieve, but only found an encouraging smile, as he knew that anything more would only destroy his progress. Issei-kun. Please. Continue. Continue what? He countered even as he kept his lips close enough that his hot breath tickled her softness. Lick me. Down there, she managed to murmur, though managed to blush deeply enough to make her faint if she had been still a human. Issei could have forced her to be more explicit, but decided that was enough victory for the day, and dived back to her wetness, accompanied by her enthusiastic cries. As her orgasm rapidly closed in, she even surprised him by grabbing his head roughly while trying to contain her orgasm, giving the first sign that under all that religious oppression lay a sexy minx begging to be let out. And Issei was more than enthusiastic about doing that, one step at a time. We will be stopping there. Hope you guys enjoyed the video and I will be seeing you guys next time. Bye.